Well, hello everyone, and good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this roundtable discussion entitled Understanding and Responding to Cuckooing. My name is Dr. Jack Spicer, and I'm going to be chairing this roundtable discussion. I'm a criminologist based at the University of Bath, and I've been studying and writing a bit on this area of cuckooing for a few years now. And I'm delighted that joining me in this session are four other people who have been studying and writing and conducting research on this area too. So they'll introduce themselves in more detail shortly, but just to outline who else is on the panel. Right from the start, we have Dr. Laura Bainbridge, Professor Rose Broad, Professor Simon Harding, and Professor Stephen MacDonald. And as I said, all of these members of the panel have undertaken work, or indeed maybe currently undertaking research on this topic of cuckooing in some form or another. And importantly, all of the panelists come at this issue from different angles, whether that be adopting different theoretical lenses to look at this problem, or focusing on a range of relevant issues that might be attached or connected to the topic of cuckooing as well. And as this is an area of perhaps increasing importance, perhaps of increasing interest, yet one that arguably remains relatively under-researched, we thought that this would be a suitable forum for, I guess, in some ways taking stock of where we are now in relation to research and understanding on this issue, as well as a really nice forum to discuss a range of pertinent issues and think about the future, hence why we've decided to undertake this roundtable discussion format. And given that this is a roundtable discussion, there will not be any formal presentations in the way in which you might expect from a conference, or PowerPoint slides for that matter either. Instead, I've sketched out some broad questions that I'll ask the panel members to consider and discuss. So we'll do that over the next hour. But given the nature of this session, we'd also really like to encourage you as the audience to really get involved in this discussion as well. So please can I ask you all, if you do have any questions, and I'd encourage you to ask sort of any and everything on this topic, please do post those questions in the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to collate them all and then relay them to our panel in the last 15 minutes or so of this session. So I hope that all sounds okay. Without further ado, what I'll now ask each panelist to do is just to quickly introduce themselves, talk about their wider research interests, and give us a brief flavour of their specific interest in this topic of cuckooing. So in no particular order, Laura, I wonder if you could kick us off here first, please.
Thank you, Jack. So yeah, I'm Dr. Laura Bainbridge. I'm a lecturer in criminal justice at the University of Leeds in the UK. My research specialisms tend to focus on kind of violence reduction and the way that policies transfer across the globe. But more recently, I have been researching cuckooing victimization, specifically looking at the pathways to victimization and the various kind of strategies or mechanisms that could be put in place to reduce victimization, primarily by the police, but also by other community partners as well. Thanks, Jack.
Well, thanks, Laura. Simon, did you want to go next?
Yes, thanks, Jack. My name is Professor Simon Harding. I'm a professor of criminology at the University of West London. And my particular research area of expertise and interest is ranges from street gangs and youth violence through to county lines, drug markets, and modern slavery and exploitation. So quite the gamut. I first came upon cuckooing when I was working as a housing researcher back in 1985, would you believe? Quite a while back. It wasn't called cuckooing then, but it certainly had an origin in the field of housing and housing research and management. So I still actively work very much on cuckooing. I've just completed over 100 interviews now with people who are involved in cuckooing, either as a victim or an offender, basically, and hope to be writing that up soon. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Simon. Maybe we'll come back to that historical context a little bit later on in the session as well. That'd be fascinating. Rose, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Jack. I'm Rose Broad. I'm a professor of criminology at the University of Manchester. And my main research has been around human trafficking and then modern slavery when that term was introduced. And then I came to cuckooing probably when it started to be talked about in modern slavery meetings. So where I would be maybe with a steering group of a project or with some NGOs, and they would start talking about mostly county lines and cuckooing together, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. So cuckooing then came up, and I've been doing some specific work across Greater Manchester with professionals on the way that they respond to cuckooing victims. So with police and housing, as Simon said, and adult social care and a number of other agencies around their response to victims. Thank you for having me along.
Thanks, Rose. And then last but not least, Stephen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steve MacDonald. I'm Professor of Social Work at Durham University. My research primarily focuses on disabled people, and most of my research very much looks at hate crime, mate crime, community forms of violence and exploitation, and because of this has led us into the field of cuckooing. Originally, again, when I started looking at this, we were looking at county lines networks within our communities, which we're working within. But since starting research in the field of cuckooing, we've somewhat moved away from that and very much focused on localized forms of cuckooing.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you very much. And I think a really essential, other piece of the cuckooing puzzle, I think, which is okay. I mean, I thought to begin with, it would be worth just broadly introducing this concept, this idea of cuckooing before we go any further. So I'd like to invite the panelists to consider what they consider cuckooing actually to be, how you might go about defining it or conceptualizing it yourself. That might include the type of people who are affected by cuckooing, as well as the people undertaking it, and perhaps encouraging some reflection on the very term itself. Is it appropriate? Is it useful? Should we consider alternatives, for example? Simon, would you like to start?
Yeah, kicking off with a definition. Wasn't quite ready for that, but I'll give it a go. It is a form of coercive control and exploitation of vulnerable people in their current domestic context. I would try for that. I don't know, that doesn't capture everything, and there are multiple aspects to this, and there is also the nexus between housing and disability, and I'm very pleased Stephen's here to cover that side. So, but that's probably where I would pitch it right from the start.
Laura, I know you've perhaps considered some of the ideas of the term itself and the definition. Did you have anything to add to that?
No, other than I think that cuckooing has become so closely aligned with county lines activity that it's often kind of situated within this. It's a situation where vulnerable people's homes are taken over to store or cut or sell drugs, weapons, money, whatever it might be. But actually, as Simon mentioned earlier, cuckooing has a much longer history and doesn't always have to involve, drugs markets. So I think being really careful about that is really important, just to ensure that we're not overlooking victims who are, who've been subjected to cuckooing that isn't county lines associated, I guess.
Stephen, I mean, coming to you on this topic, I mean, you raised the idea of the slightly different, perhaps, lens that you view this issue from. In terms of the definitions and conceptualizations, has that had an influence on how you've viewed this problem?
Yeah, well, I suppose my very simplistic definition is that it's, when somebody's house is being taken over, commandeered by a third party. often, as Simon referenced, in terms of through coercive control. The lens, what we looked at very much, in a sense, we looked at the relationship between home takeovers and mate crime. And the notion of befriending. We often use the concept of structurally vulnerable individuals rather than vulnerable individuals, because we are very much influenced from a disability studies in disability theory. So in terms for us, in terms of, we ask the question in terms of what is it about local communities, in terms of, and how do spaces of exploitation emerge within particular communities? Because a lot of our research very much focuses on the exploitation of disabled people. And within our research, it's not all disabled people who are exploited, who are often the victim of mate crime, and it's not all disabled people who have their homes taken over. It's particular groups, and there's an intersectional relationship there, and usually that links to areas of deprivation, poverty, social class, sometimes race and ethnicity, and certain types of disability, so neurodivergent communities as well, who are particularly at risk. So we look at the intersecting factors, and we ask the question in terms of why are certain groups made vulnerable within certain communities, what leads to exploitation. So our definition of cuckooing really very much links to the coercive control in nature of how somebody will befriend and then take over a home to use for multiple different activities, not just selling drugs, although that sometimes is the case. Certainly, and sometimes that is linked to county lines, but in our research, that the majority of cases is cases which emerge within local communities, and it's usually local people who are doing the exploitation.
Yeah, and I think it's that notion, that idea of vulnerability, I think has already come up and seems quite prominent. And I would argue it's difficult perhaps to separate the contemporary conceptualization of cuckooing and how it's understood without understanding it as having been influenced by the discourses surrounding vulnerability and the desire by the police and others to not just recognize vulnerability but respond to it as well. Yeah. Rose, did you want to add anything to this discussion? So
yeah, I think in terms of the definition, it's probably useful, especially for people who are maybe not from the UK, to say that cuckooing isn't a criminal offence. There's no definition of a criminal offence that is cuckooing, and I think that causes a lot of problems for both people who are trying to identify as victims of something that isn't an offence, and also for professionals when they're trying to put it into another box. Obviously, part of that has come under modern slavery, but there's not consensus even across one borough, I don't think, of whether modern slavery is the appropriate framework for it. I think perhaps it isn't, but I know that there's lots of views that people think yes, it fits, but there's also some guidance that's been given by the UK Director of Public Prosecutions that says that it doesn't fit and we need separate legislation. So that kind of conversation is ongoing at the moment. And I think, it's hard enough, I think, if you're trying to identify as a victim of crime, if that is actually a crime. But I think if it's just something that people tell you, especially when it has, and I know, Jack, you asked this, especially when it's got a kind of a funny name, if you don't know what it is, and I know that professionals are not keen. We did some focus groups across with lots of agencies, as I said, and there were only 3 people out of 40 who were keen on the term. They felt like it made it sound not serious enough. It caused problems with people trying to understand what it meant. It made it sound like something cartoonish. It was confused with cuckolding. If you like, for older people, it was sort of made that link. So I think all of that is very confusing, and I've heard people talk about things like home exploitation or those kinds of things that might be an alternative term. I think cuckooing is a bit of a problematic term, and I think if they do move in the direction of specific legislation, I don't think they should call it that. I don't know whether they will.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and important point, and one that I've come across both in research but also when I've gone to events and spoke at events in front of practitioners, and it's an issue that's been raised. I remember someone relatively recently saying to me that they thought it was quite dehumanizing. I mean, obviously the term derives from the practice of wild cuckoo birds, suggesting actually, building on what you said, Rose, that actually this is a very good way of talking about something really serious. I guess one perhaps response to that in terms of playing devil's advocate is that perhaps by abandoning that term and trying to use something else, we end up losing the awareness that has been raised on this topic over the last few years as well. I don't know if that's something, Simon, that you have any thoughts on, given your work in this area over recent.
Well, yes. I mean, it's interesting. Interesting debate to consider. Is it a valuable term or not? Another term I've just scribbled down that I'm aware of is parasitic attachment or parasitic control. Cuckooing, yes, I understand, as a term, it might also be very UK oriented and based, because I know the cuckoo bird is in parts of Europe outside Britain, but not universally. So it does attach itself to a specific meaning of a specific bird. Yes, I first came upon this when I was working as a young housing researcher. I hesitate to say it, but almost 40 years ago. And it was very much more aligned to this idea of kind of parasitic attachment, really. There was a struggle to find the vocabulary for it. And if the person had, and I must say, a visible disability, Stephen, then it was considered to be something along the lines of mate crime or, something of that ilk. Neurodiversity issues 40 years ago were very hard to locate or identify, and people simply didn't understand them in the way they hopefully do now. So very much an origin in terms of housing management, people who would move in, maybe ultimately sublet a property, but ensconce themselves effectively, and maybe eventually push the individual out, but maybe not push them out, maybe develop a kind of symbiotic relationship with them, where the person is being used and abused, maybe wrung out for money in a particular way, or their prescribed medicine might be used, for example, or their benefits might be purloined. So a number of different kind of mechanisms and reasons for doing it. And of course, that leads into different multiple variations. But certainly, my early experience of it was from the field of housing, and it was something that usually came up sometimes by a social worker, sometimes even by a district nurse, and sometimes by the local housing manager, and occasionally people who were experiencing it as a victim. And the victim offender nexus here is something we can maybe return to, but they would come in to report, maybe when they were paying their rent, to say, I have a problem, I've got somebody here who has kind of moved in with me, and I can't get them out, and they're now kind of taking things. And again, exploitation was not part of the vocabulary at that point, but that was very much intimated as to what was happening. So it's curious that the vocabulary used to kind of frame this and around discourse and the actuality of it has changed quite significantly over the past 30 or 40 years. But it's an old crime. It's just old wine in new bottles.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Simon. So I think maybe let's pick up and run with that theme of the offender nexus maybe a little bit more then, and perhaps also building on the important point that you said, Rose, which was around cuckooing itself not actually being a crime per se. But of course, we know that cuckooing is often strongly connected with other crimes or social harms more broadly. Laura, did you want to talk about this in relation to county lines, perhaps, or any other crime?
No, that's fine. I think one of the problematic scenarios for the police in particular is that what I call the kind of continuum of complicity. So you have kind of ideal victim at the one end and then complicit victim at the other. And quite a lot of cuckooing cases fall right in the middle. So in terms of the kind of victim perpetrator nexus, it can be really tough to untangle that relationship, because the thing with cuckooing victims is often that they truly believe that the person who has taken over their home is their friend. For whatever reason, perhaps they've given them drugs or money or friendship or sex, whatever it might be. There's usually a kind of exchange relationship there, and kind of recognizing that exploitation can take time. And I think part of the police response at the moment is that trying to gain access to the property, or trying to encourage the victim to engage with services to recognize that what is happening is not okay, that their home should be a safe space, and that it currently isn't. And I think that is really tough, particularly when the victim perhaps is neurodivergent, perhaps has mental health issues, perhaps is just incredibly lonely. So yeah, I think that seems to be, from the research findings that are kind of emerging from my study, that seems to be the kind of the difficult grey area that the police are kind of struggling to operate within.
Absolutely, I think that corresponds. To the amount of time I spent with police officers and sometimes other professionals stood outside flats while the police tried to negotiate their ways in. I mean, Stephen, from a kind of social work perspective, how does that chime with the sort of both theoretical and disciplinary ideas that you bring to this area?
Yeah, I suppose from my perspective, the criminal justice system is just one agency, which the police the criminal justice agencies such as the police are just one agency of multiple agencies which we deal with. I think drawn on both points which have been discussed here, if we go back in terms of thinking about the history, I think a lot more research needs to be done in this area, but it's really interesting, especially what Simon says about in terms of historically somebody with a physical impairment or sensory impairment might go to the housing office and report their houses being taken over. But especially in terms of mental health, which we know is a significant population, or in terms of neurodivergent populations, if we think about what's happened since the 1980s, we went through a period of deinstitutionalization. So in the UK, mental hospitals were closed down because of the Mental Health Act. And this led to community care. And people being supported in the community. And as community care has developed, rather than improving, especially because of austerity in the UK from 2008, we've seen a disappearance of services. Research which we looked at loneliness across the Northeast in terms of it was disabled people who were the most overrepresented in groups which reported loneliness and isolation. And if you compare that with a disappearance of services, it creates spaces of exploitation. And I think it's in these spaces of exploitation where local people or organised, OCGs, organised criminal groups, can come in and take over these spaces. So I think that's really important. And also I always think about responses, and I think police responses in collecting evidence, social work responses of collecting information, community health responses of collecting information often aren't great. So especially if you've got a significant mental health issue or neurodivergent, if you're part of the neurodivergent community, then especially from a criminal justice perspective, collecting information from some of these groups is difficult. So they're often overlooked and sometimes they're criminalized. So the houses are seen as a space of antisocial behavior, and rather than seeing that as a red flag, often the person who lives there is criminalized. So it's a big problem, and what we see in our research is there's a lack of sharing of information. When we speak to practitioners, I speak to multiple practitioners and they can all give us examples of houses which have been cuckooed within their local area. But when we think about joined up responses, there's very little joined up responses. And for me, that's the problem. So I don't see this as a police issue. I see this as really a poor multi-agency responses to the phenomenon problem that we have in terms of cuckooing, which I think is far more widespread within communities than what is reported on because of the link to county lines. And I actually agree in terms of with Laura in relation to that link between, you know, Jack, in your research, when you talk about the different forms of cuckooing, so the parasitic nest invasion is the classic where it's a disabled person who's been befriended, and then his or her house has been taken over. But usually it's not like that in terms of, especially if the person engages in low-level forms of crime, criminality, drug use, etc. And then once this relationship is developed and the home is taken over, then often it's the disabled person who's often criminalised, and it's not really until exploitation is quite far down where we start seeing multi-agency responses.
Jack, can I add something to that? Would that be okay? Yeah. Sorry, I think that's really, really interesting what Stephen's just said, and my colleague and I, Amy Lockery, we've been talking a little bit about the fraying of the kind of welfare state safety net, and how people who potentially would have been kind of captured in that net as a kind of victim are now falling through and hitting the policing, you know, enforcement and criminal justice net instead, and just thinking about the kind of repercussions of that, you know, in terms of, you know, longer life impact, and also where do alpha victims sit within this as well, because again, they probably would have been caught with the welfare state safety net, and again a hitting the police safety net hard. So I think there's some really interesting kind of social and economic factors here that can't be overlooked as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just going to add to that for me, one of the complexities that brings the police in sometimes too early and wrongly is that the lens that they're seeing this through is essentially some kind of transactional relationship between the victim and the offender, where the victim, and you may even have to put that in quotation marks, is obtaining, receiving, or getting some kind of benefit from this symbiotic relationship. You know, whether it's a kind of whether it's drugs is obviously the key and most obvious one, county lines, drug dealing, whether it's a county line or whether it's a local drug dealing that's taking place. But even things like loneliness, as Stephen mentioned, which I think is a real factor, has a transactional component to it as well. You know, the quid pro quo is that you are getting company. Now, that might be coercive companionship, but it's still some form of transactional relationship. So I don't think we've worked that out. I don't think people have really thought that through sufficiently. And I think with the changes in housing from local authority management here in the UK to registered social landlords and housing associations and private landlords, all that type of thing, a lot of that knowledge has really been lost, and the care and the safeguarding and the managerial element that used to be there perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago has also gone. So these things tend to surface, as Stephen said, when antisocial behavior arises, or there's some kind of violent incident or interface with neighbors that goes badly wrong. And those suddenly it all kind of comes to the surface. But following on very quickly behind the transactional relationship is agency, and the level of agency that a particular individual may have or may present. And that can also change the dynamic in the situation, but it can change the dynamic in terms of how the police respond.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that and that point on agency, which I think is crucial. Rose, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that idea of agency, but also how this might align with discourses of modern slavery, for example.
I think maybe I'll come to that. What I was just thinking while you were talking then, and hopefully I didn't miss it and briefly when I had to pop out, that one of the problems, like Stephen just said, is one of ownership, and that I think there's a lack of ownership of the cases, and there's a lot of pushing, oh, that's not our problem, it's a social care problem, no, it's a police problem, no, it's a housing problem, and there isn't a kind of oversight, and then people, like Laura said, slip through the net. So I don't know whether that's a lack of understanding. I think partly it's to do with, and this maybe does touch on the relevance of modern slavery, I think cuckooing isn't one thing, and I think we'd all probably agree. And I wouldn't, in the conversations that I had here, I think on the one side there was quite cuckooing that was quite heavily embedded within known organised crime groups that purposefully targeted somebody, usually with disability or neurodiversity, and made some money from that arrangement. And then right over the other side, there was just groups of quite chaotic people, all of who were maybe using substances, and some of whom were homeless, and then maybe one of them gets a house and then somebody exploits somebody else, but it could be another person the next week. And those two things are not the same, and they don't require the same response, but they're both referred to as cuckooing. And I think probably the bit that's over here is more usefully addressed under the modern slavery umbrella, but the bit over here is much more difficult, and I think it's embedded in all those things that everybody else has mentioned around, you know, historic dismantling of public services, of austerity, of even the big society. You know, everybody will look after everyone in their neighborhoods. They're not doing that, and the isolation, I think, is something that came up over and over again with people, professionals knowing, you know, they know what's happening in their local areas, but they don't have the capacity. There aren't, you know, local neighbourhood officers really that know what's happening. Maybe there are in some areas, but not in others. So I think, yeah, the diversity of the problem, it creates a difficulty for the response by calling it one thing.
Yes, I think to add to that, and also Laura's particular point around the net being people falling through that net, I would probably add what's happened to drug services and drug treatment over the last decade or so here as well, in terms of broad policies, reductions in funding, but also reductions in outreach workers as well. You know, speaking with someone who was an outreach worker 15 years or so ago in the drug treatment field, and would have a good understanding of what his clients and the wider community were up to, and hearing things on the ground, and the reduction of those people, I think, has possibly played a part in this as well. And again, like you say, the police end up bearing the brunt of this. I don't know if it chimes with some of your fieldwork experiences as well, Simon, but going back to your point around the police perhaps possibly entering the situation too early. But from my experiences, cuckooed properties can also pose as quite attractive to the police, because they view them as an opportunity to find drug dealers when they're out looking for them. You know, they represent a site where they may well, if they're to enter the property, find someone they're interested in finding, or find drugs, or you know, what have you. Did that align with some of the things that you've?
Yes, very much, Jack. You know, it's a kind of form of containment, really, and kind of knowing, you know, where people are. And, you know, it also leads into long-term observational surveillance of some properties. I guess in my experience, a lot of these things come to light, especially when it's connected to drugs and drug supply and trafficking and drug dealing, is by the neighbors, because, you know, it's the neighbors that get pissed off when endless streams of people, you know, trail up the stairs or knock on doors or get the wrong doorbell, or arrive and slam doors late at night, and people endlessly moving in and out, and sometimes being abusive and hammering on the door, you know, if somebody hasn't answered. So it's those kind of things that generally tend to alert either the housing management, the landlord, or the police. But there's a very wide spectrum of responses, both in terms of how the response is done, who makes the response, how quickly the response comes, so on and so forth. And I've dealt with many victims or people who have been cuckooed, and they're prepared to put up, in some cases, with quite a lot of antisocial behavior, both inside and around the property, before they themselves finally think, okay, enough is enough. You know, this person has to go. Maybe the internal dynamic changes, and that symbiosis or transactional relationship breaks down, but they suddenly want the person out. And they can, what I was able to identify that it was that they can use different forms of agency to bring about that ending. So they themselves can inform the landlord, or they themselves can inform the police. And I've had situations and experiences where the police have arrived on a particular housing estate or project, as they would be called in the States, and the person who owns the property, usually middle-aged, sometimes even mature, would approach the police and simply hand over the keys and say, there you go, flat number 25, third floor, just go in and sort it out. And the police will take the keys and they will bust or raid the property and everybody in it. And, that's one way of bringing the police in to end a particular situation. And there are many other ways that people who are being cuckooed can employ their agency to bring it to an end. One which I'm very familiar with is what I call casting off, where you basically pass the offenders onto somebody else, usually another drug dealer, another drug user, and say, well, why don't you try Alice at number 35? She's got 2 spare rooms and nobody's there, and you'll get, she'll even make you dinner. And they basically pass the individual off as a form of kind of relegation. So there can be very many different ways. I mean, I've also found drug users conspiring together, or conspiring with rival drug dealers or rival organized crime groups to bring a particular drug dealing hub, or what might be called in Britain now might be called a bando or a trap house or a crack den, to bring that to an end. So by conspiring with other people for the intervention of authorities, you can bring it to an end. So it's a peculiar mix of vulnerability, transaction, agency, and all of these things. It can be very complex and difficult to disentangle.
I think that leads us really nicely onto another sort of theme that I wanted to address, which is the responses to cuckooing. I know we've talked a bit about the police and others as well, but I think there's plenty more possibly to say. Did anyone want to discuss the responses to cuckooing that they may have observed, things that may have worked well or not, as the case may be, or any ideas for what effective responses to cuckooing might be?
From my perspective, in terms of a lot of the people who I am dealing with, in terms of really struggle to have agency, even when people have been reporting, their voices haven't necessarily been listened to, and they've reported to multiple different services. And that relates to not just in terms of cuckooing, but also our research in terms of community violence as well. And especially if it's seen as from a policing perspective, low level, and especially if they don't have knowledge in terms of different forms of exploitation, including cuckooing. So agency is difficult. So, some of the participants and some of the people I've worked with do have agency when they're socially connected, but when they have poor social connectivity to services, to the local community, to family members, then they often feel like they're, from our perspective, are entrapped within a community and within their own homes. And sometimes this goes on for a very long time. So, I've came across some horrendous cases where, one young man, where they had removed the locks from his door. And actually, usually you get local members of the community reporting incidents, but the local members of the community were actually also using his house. So he almost had nobody to turn to, and it often related to eviction, which led to a social service and then a multi-agency response, including the police. And sometimes the victims who I've worked with, in a sense, had, like I've already mentioned, had been criminalized a number of times, had fines, had cautions, and then suddenly they were going to be evicted, and housing social services have to step in, and then they realize that actually they've been exploited for quite a long time. So I think agency, some of my participants certainly have agency and have drawn on their networks, but other participants definitely have not. And I think from our perspective, from police who understand especially police actually, who have knowledge of county lines and have knowledge of cuckooing. So even when it's not necessarily county lines, they have that knowledge and they understand what agencies are out there to work with. But it's often your police officer on the ground who doesn't have that knowledge, and that's where the key issues come within our research.
Yeah, good point.
I think that's an essential point, and one that I'm sort of currently writing a little bit about, which is actually thinking about, rather than viewing policing as this monolithic thing, recognizing the variance within policing, and recognizing, for example, that neighborhood policing teams may actually be quite good at responding to cuckooing. They may have built good relationships within certain communities. They may have more time, for example, to be able to do certain things, whereas you get, for example, a response officer who's called to a job at a cuckoo property and may view the situation in a different light or decide to respond to it in a different way. And actually that variance can actually cause problems for multi-agency responses to the people experiencing it, but also within the police as well, where people, different officers may get frustrated about the actions that their colleagues have taken. Rose, I know you mentioned earlier about sort of multi-agency working and policing. I don't know if you had anything to add on.
Yeah, I think the point that you just made is really important, not to kind of just brush everything. Yeah, everybody's like that, because there's variation in policing, there's variation in social care and housing as well, especially given what Simon said about the complexity of the housing situation here, that there's some fantastic housing officers who will go beyond, what they probably should be doing to help somebody. I was talking to somebody who'd taken a victim to the bank to help them with opening a new bank account, and they took such a long time. The problem I think there is that and the same in adult social care, there's some really good work, but it seems to always be done by people who are going above and beyond their actual job, and that can't be the system that we rely on. It has to be embedded somewhere. And so I think that's a problem with the problem that you identified with police goes everywhere. There are really good people, and there are also people who are not necessarily not good, but they're maybe just not aware, they're not trained, they haven't come across it before, and they don't know what to do. The other thing that I wanted to say has escaped me. About it'll come back to me in a minute, probably.
That's okay. I'll come.
Should have written it down.
I'll come to Laura and then.
One point in terms of just about the policing, but also the disappearance of adult social workers as well. That is having a huge problem, because most of the resources in social work now are in children's services, which are aimed to protect children who experience abuse within the home. But actually, that is often at the cost of, because of cutbacks, adult services, and it's really adult services which will be crucial in this role in terms of many of these teams. Sorry, I'll stop speaking now.
And Stephen, those multi-agency partnership arrangements have really all withered away over the past 10 or 12, 13 years with the current government we have here in the UK. Whereas before they worked better. They weren't great, but they worked better than they do now. So in the absence of these multi-agency partnership frameworks, we're left with the final response, which really is just the police response, and it's about enforcement. So we need to go upstream and deal with these issues at a far earlier stage of early intervention, before it gets to the point where everyone's calling the police and saying you've got to shut that place down because it's become a nightmare for everyone. And so, about moving upstream, and partnership working would help do that, I think.
Laura, did you want to come in?
Yeah, so I've been looking at the strategies that the police and community partners have been implementing, particularly across the north of England over the last few years. And I would say that there are many multi-agency partnerships operating. But there's a general consensus that the police and their partners have no idea about numbers, how many people are either at risk or currently being cuckooed. And that's for various reasons, but one of them is because they don't have a specific cuckooing flag on their system. So the police are recording cuckooing in many, many different ways, and some of them can't spell cuckooing. So it will go down as, a slight variation. So they get lost during the kind of morning intelligence analysis briefings. so that's an issue. I think talking about going upstream, the reality is that we have a really complex, stretched social housing or lack of social housing right now. Like, so I think in an ideal world, we would not place a vulnerable potential cuckooing victim in a kind of, a deprived area where we know that there's potential county lines activity or other types of exploitation. But the reality is that we're probably going to do that because we don't have enough housing. So one of the things I've been really interested in is this idea of sensitive lets. So this kind of arrangement where you recognize that what you're doing is risky. You know that you're placing a vulnerable person almost at risk by putting them in this area, but you're wrapping services around them. So kind of awareness raising around exploitation, about the, who is permitted into your home, how you can say no, all of these different things. And for me, this feels like a better option than just moving people constantly, because what we find is that cuckooing victims are often repeatedly targeted, and we're just moving the problem to kind of different neighborhoods. So for me, kind of sensitive lets and kind of a kind of 360 wrap around awareness raising and check-in is a sensible solution. But again, that will require resource, time, all of these different things. But I'll be looking at that next year, so I'll let you know how I get on.
Laura, I think that's a really good idea, but how is that going to work for people who have lived in a property for 10, 15, 20 years, and then their personal circumstances change such that being cuckooed almost becomes an arrangement that they're prepared to put up with or accept? And I'm thinking about people who are basically on the breadline, people who have suffered from austerity, and really their day-to-day existence is now about survival. And if somebody comes in who's prepared to enter into some transactional arrangement, that might suddenly be attractive. So
it's a really good deal, Simon. If someone says to you,
it can be,
I will use your spare room for a week and you can have unlimited drugs or you can have this amount, it's a good deal. It's not difficult to find potential cuckooing victims, and that's what's really tragic, I think. For me, some of this is about disruption. So gaining access to properties that have been cuckooed is notoriously difficult, particularly because the police don't have a right of access. The victim will just shut the door. Housing associations fare a little bit better because they can go in and do checks. But one of the things I've been looking at is who has access to that property. So, for example, electricians, people who check boilers, spec savers who are doing home visits now, like who fire officers, anyone who can get through the door. We should be training them to kind of use their professional curiosity to say something's not right here. It's a gut instinct or something is up. And then I think it is up to the various kind of social services to intervene, particularly if there's children involved. But it's tough, and in a cost of living crisis as well.
Yeah, fire service officers are a very good one, by the way. They're permitted direct access. So yeah.
But again, they are heavily overworked, and do they know the referral mechanism to kind of flag that maybe it's really tough. The other people who I think should be really on it are those who give out keys or fobs to social housing. So if you've got someone who's recurrently losing their key or fob, I think there should be a question about why, and actually are they being handed out, or those just gentle curiosity might be a really kind of important tool to kind of reduce victimization, I think. But the question of how do we stop people being re-victimized is really tough, particularly if they like the deal.
Absolutely, very big issue. I mean, I interviewed a man recently in his late 60s, early 70s, and he had been a drug user in his younger life, but not of late. But again, because of austerity and no money, someone made him an offer, basically, and he took up the offer, and his life spiraled downwards so quickly. Just because he was trying to make ends meet. And these people came in and they ended up running a business from his property. And I think that's another issue. Once people, in terms of the spectrum of cuckooing, some people are more invisible, if you like, both as a victim and as an offender. And some people are just brazen. They will basically run a business from your property, and with very little kind of boundaries of who can see that, or is it visible to the neighbors? And that again is going to bring police in hard. And it's going to go badly for the victim, because they're going to be seen as complicit to quite extensive criminality. So yeah, difficult situations, I think, there.
And that's one of the threats that they'll use. You know, the cuckooing perpetrators, you know, you're complicit now, you're going to lose your property, you're going to lose your children.
Yes.
So it's, you know, and quite often they'll place the victim in debt bondage, so that, you know, there's particular areas where the perpetrators are staging burglaries to say £2,000 has been stolen, you now owe us that money, so you're going to have to deal on the street. So, you know, it's quite a sophisticated setup in some cases. Sometimes it really isn't, and it's not discreet in any way, shape or form. So I think it depends on the OCG or the nature of the localized crime group.
Yeah, which very neatly, I guess, goes back to that idea of variance that we've referred to. That's referred to various times as well. I'm conscious that we have only 5 minutes left of the hour that I've sort of allocated for discussion. So I'm conscious to make sure we get to the final question that I wanted us to address. But before we do so, just to remind the audience that we will be giving 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So please do put any questions into the Q&A that you might have, so we can address them. But the final area that I'd like us to discuss before that is around our current knowledge base on cuckooing, the research that has been done, and perhaps what future research needs to be undertaken. Stephen, I noticed you mentioned possibly earlier the fact that more research is required, that classic researcher phrase. Did you have any thoughts on?
Oh no, shouldn't have said that. I think in terms of what Laura was saying about wraparound services around homes, that's really an important consideration in terms of what we see, because we've got a paper coming out soon which we talk about domestic colonization, which is a broader concept of cuckooing, but also when homes are being exploited in different ways from the outside, not just within. And usually what happens is people get moved. And what is really important is that we stop that from happening, because actually in terms of cuckooing, then houses can be picked up very quickly at you know, in terms of when people have been moved, in terms of when houses become a site of abuse, in terms of then we're rewarding the perpetrator and punishing the victim in these situations. So from our perspective, we're really interested in developing more research from a local perspective, looking at local forms of exploitation and violence and localized cuckooing. And I think that a lot more research needs to be done to think about, well, the extent of cuckooing, broadening the research which yourself and Simon have done in terms of typologies of cuckooing and different forms of cuckooing. And we really want to identify in terms of how the process of cuckooing takes place, but also in terms of that link to county lines. So for our perspective, in terms of, we think that localized cuckooing creates that space where if a county line comes into an area, then in a sense, just in the same way they take over the networks of crack cocaine, heroin and other forms of drugs, they take over the network of cuckooed houses. So for us, that is a really important area of research, localized cuckooing. So that's where we would like to go in the future in relation to research.
Brilliant, thank you, Steve. Rose, did you have any thoughts
on? I think I remembered the thing that I wanted to say, which is what Laura said about moving victims. And I think there needs to be, you know, I think at the moment the approach seems to be we need to move the victim, which, I mean, there's so many people that are potentially able to be victimized that it doesn't do anything really, and it's very stressful for a number of reasons, moving people outside of a place where they might have lived for a long time. So I think looking at alternatives to that and how, just an alternative response really to focusing on the movement of victims.
Which I guess leads a little bit to the paper that I published a couple of years ago around the amplification spiral. And actually, when you're moving people around in various ways, it can just simply amplify the problem, both in a material sense, but also in the perceptions of people's heads about the problem as well, which can often instigate the same responses, which further amplify. So the spiral goes on. Laura, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think linked to that, I'd really like to see a piece of research conducted around partial closure orders. So this kind of idea that the housing association or local authority can apply to court and basically say to the person who lives in the property, you're not allowed anyone to come in, and they can place the notice in the window to say, this isn't my fault, they've caught up with you and your cuckooing behavior, so I'm not to blame, I'm not a grass, etc. I'd like to see a bit of research around that, to look at the kind of the risks and the benefits of that kind of strategy to end cuckooing, because ultimately you close one cuckooed property and another one just pops up. We're just displacing all of this activity. But yeah, I'd also like to, as part of that study, I'd like to know a little bit more about whether if you place the partial closure order as like kind of a visible thing, does it reduce kind of feelings of community safety? i.e., are you just raising public or community fears around the kind of safety of their own neighbourhood? So yeah, that would be a very specific piece of work I'd like to do. I might get a PhD student to look at that one for me.
Brilliant. Yeah, sounds great. Simon?
All good ideas. Yeah. Well, ask a researcher what research needs done, and I would say all of it, in every direction, up, down, sideways, breadth-wise and depth-wise. There's so much to do here, and we really are only scratching the surface of it. Both Jack and I have developed typologies of cuckooing. There's a lot more work to do. All the issues around definition, greater exposition of the stories of people involved on the victim and the offender side, and again, those who are both victim and offender, because that can happen as well. Issues around vulnerability, neurodiversity, and so all of that kind of contextual, situational stuff around motivations and practice, and then on the other side of that are the responses. And Jack, I know you're heavily involved in the kind of looking at the enforcement side, and that's really powerful and very useful. But there are many other agencies that really don't chip in here in the way that they should do. Social workers, for example, home repair people, district nurses, people who have a legitimate entree into properties need really to be trained around some of this so that they can recognize it. And again, here in the UK, we have a proliferation of what we call registered social landlords, people who are not the local authority, but they manage social housing and rented accommodation. I just think they need to do more. There are pockets of good practice, but those pockets of good practice tend to rely on one or two individuals who are in a handful of organizations, and they bring the solutions because of their personal energy and their commitment. And when they move on, it just all falls through. So, we need a far more consistent level of understanding, training, etc. around the whole domain. And maybe we do need to have some kind of offence based on parasitic attachment or whatever we call it, so that there is, a particular offence. Quite what that is, I haven't given it enough thought yet, but there could be something there because it's needed.
The Home Office are working on it, Simon, so we don't have to worry about that. That's covered. I just wanted to just very quickly throw in, like, private landlords as well are problematic, because they potentially, particularly if they're not great landlords, don't want anything to do with it. So some of the police I've been speaking to have said that they will reach out to the landlord, no response until they say, by the way, you're going to be prosecuted for being complicit in drug dealing. Bang, straight away they're engaged. So I think there's private landlord engagement issues as well that need to be addressed. So yeah, we can't overlook them too.
Good point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I think very neatly goes back to something you referred to right at the start, Stephen, which is that structural vulnerability, recognizing that people affected by Cuckooing, yes, it's a very diverse population and people are affected in different ways and have different levels and forms of agency, but that structural context and the structural vulnerability that they're surrounded, from my perspective, the key to effectively responding to.
And neurodiversity, I think, is for me the biggest issue that I see on a regular basis now. And structural vulnerability can lead very much into invisibility, and a lot of disabled people do fall into the category of being socially invisible, even within their own communities. And I just don't think we've worked all of that out sufficiently yet, or the relationships that kind of are multiplex here. We need to understand it better.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think in terms of disability has been invisible and within criminology, so the study of criminology in terms of obviously pathological understandings of disability have appeared within research within the criminal justice system, but in terms of when we think about victimization, criminology and disability studies have been very late in relation in understanding and researching systems of exploitation and vulnerability and victimization within the disabled community.
I agree. We all agree.
I think one thing we do need to really acknowledge, though, is the impact that being cuckooed can have on a victim. That feeling of being powerless. We're seeing, I'm hearing narratives around people feeling suicidal or who have taken their own lives, and that the intimidation and violence that can occur within a cuckooing situation, particularly when the perpetrator is asked to leave, that seems to be generally a tipping point. Like, it's time for you to go. Okay, now we get violent. It's not just a case of them continuing to deal drugs. Quite often, as there's weapons involved, there's a lot of coercive control involved, there's threats. It's a really ugly crime that isn't a crime. And I think linked to that, one thing I've been hearing that is really interesting is that cuckooing perpetrators do not want a modern slavery conviction. They're happy to be not happy, but content to be convicted of kind of a drugs market offence. They absolutely do not want a modern slavery conviction, because in terms of their reputation, I think on the street, it's not great, but also in terms of where they'd be incarcerated and who they'd be incarcerated with. So there may be some lever there that can be pulled in terms of the new legislation that kind of aligns cuckooing to modern slavery in a way that that may act as a disincentive. But again, as with cuckooing victims, you eliminate one county line and bang, the next day you've got two more. So it's I've literally been writing a report for the police I've been working with, and the first line is, it's not, could you please do something about your organised crime groups, because that's where the problem is. But after that, we come down to the reality of their behaviours and the markets that they just seem to dominate. One of the police officers describes it as whack-a-mole, and I think that's a pretty good description. Yeah.
I'm going to we've had a question in, and I'm conscious that we have to wrap up in 5 minutes, so I'm very conscious that I want us to address the question. So this has come from Alan Dawes. Thank you, Alan, for asking this question, and he's asked, is there any data on whether cuckooers strike in their own home areas, such as within 5 kilometres of their usual home, or do they travel further away to commit their crimes, such as burglars, thieves, and other criminals? I think it's an excellent question. I think it aligns very closely with the notion of county lines. Does anyone want to take that?
I can jump in very quickly on that one. It's both, actually. It's both. It just depends which end of the line you're at, or whether it's a county line or a local, what we used to call in old-fashioned parlance, a local drug market. Bearing in mind a county line is usually from point A to point B, and point B being in a different county or a different town. It's not always quite like that, but I've come upon all of these examples, to be honest with you. I've also come upon examples where particular organized crime groups or drug networks have their own network of properties that they can cuckoo from town to town to town, and they can move around, or they'll have 10 or 15 properties that they will use on a rotated basis within one town. So, for example, let's say in Britain, it could be Great Yarmouth or Grimsby or somewhere like that, or Plymouth. And there's certainly examples of that I come upon on a regular basis. So it's both. Both, I think, Alan, is the answer to that question.
Yeah. I would agree. And what was I going to say? It was something about the end. It was something about. I'm sorry. It was something about the end of the line. Ignore me. I'll come back if we've got time. That was exactly what I wanted to say, Simon. That was it. Sometimes the county lines gangs as well will share information on cuckooed properties. Yeah. So they'll send out some sort of flash alert to be like, flat B and wherever is down, but you could use this one instead. And I think I found that quite interesting, because you often see them, these county lines gangs as being quite territorial, sometimes violent towards each other, but actually they're just sharing information the same way that potential local businesses might. I thought that was quite interesting.
Laura, I can add to that. I interviewed a young woman whose modus operandi for finding a place to cuckoo was to go to a local pharmacy 9 o'clock in the morning here in the UK and wait in line for people who were getting methadone prescriptions. And when they walked out, she would approach them and ask them and say, do you know where I can crash? And that was enough to have an invite into 2 or 3 properties. And of those, one of them would fit. So it's
not unusual, Simon. I'm hearing about people being followed home and being told that your property is now mine. I've also been hearing stories about them waiting in A&E for people demanding particular drugs and saying, I'll give you them if you let me use your house. Like I said, some of them are quite sophisticated. Others not so much.
Yes.
But I suppose also just one last thing I agree with both of you, what you are saying in terms of local land. It's people move across counties, but also family members. So I have came across family members. An incident which I recently came across was the son of the mother who basically moved back into the home to set up his drug enterprise. So in terms of, and I've heard a number of stories actually where it's maybe an uncle or a nephew who moves in and then uses the property, which then adds an extra layer of complexity.
Yes,
brilliant. Well, Alan's got back in touch to say thank you, so I think we've sufficiently answered that question. He also knows where Yarmouth is, so further context that's there as well. I'm very conscious of time. In the UK, it's coming up to 11:15 as well. So I think, at least for myself, will be ready to venture off to bed relatively soon. But I will conclude now just by thanking Stephen, Simon, Laura and Rose for what I found myself to be a really stimulating conversation. And it feels like the start of a conversation really that I hope will continue to the future. So thank you very much for all of your contributions. I'm looking forward to reading future work and having future discussions possibly in the future on this area.